very new direction, and a lot of people say it could be the future. From hip-hop to metal to even pop itself, they introduce a lot of different things into their music and combine a lot of different genres. They're just integrating a whole bunch of different stuff. There are a lot of bands of today's day and age that are very easy to forget about. They're forgettable because you don't really know their identity. You think of One Direction, you don't really know who they are individually just by how popular they are. You really just think of them as, oh, I know this song, I know this song. But with Death Grips, they're really discernible because everything they do is so unique compared to everything else. That's why they're one of the greatest bands around today, or of the decade, because they're so unique as a collective group. You think of Death Grips and you think of how crazy MC Ride is and how ambiguous, and they start off the bat with incredible music. Their live performances are also extremely unique. A lot of the time they cancel their shows just because they don't feel like going to them, leaving out very important bands that they have shows with to just be on their own because they feel like it. At one of their shows, instead of going, they just left a toy kit of a drum kit on stage for the fans, which really screwed them out of their money. A lot of their actions aren't respectful to their fans, but that's also what makes them so unique and so attractive to a lot of people, because they're something entirely fresh and new.
This guy knows more about it than most people, and he's going to tell you why. Isn't that right, Ethan?
Well, I don't know that much about it, but because like the lyrics are pretty cryptic and stuff. But there's a lot of the writing of Death Grips lyrics. They're really poetic, and this album especially is pretty vulgar in the subject matter, but it's very in depth, I should say. Like there's a lot of allusions and stuff, like Bottomless Pit, for instance, like the name of the album. That's what I believe Charles Manson used to call like one of his hideouts.
That's interesting.
On one of their songs, PV Poison, they used like, it's about like their fan base and how they'll like respond to anything with like in a frenzy. So like when Zach Hill tweeted "It Won't Lit," a bunch of people went crazy about it. So like in the song, they used like "It Won't Lit" in like the lyrics a bunch.
Mm-hmm. They talked about how the fan base turns everything into an internet meme. It's an internet frenzy, as you said.
The band includes a lot of distorted noises and sounds.
Lots of abrasive stuff.
Yeah. Not a lot of people like it for that reason.
Some people say it's like an acquired taste. It's really harsh, like weird, unique music, and the lyrics, you know, they can be kind of vulgar, so it's not appealing to like a mass audience.
In all forms of art, there are examples of, you know, conformity and non-conformity, choosing. Every artist has someone that they base their work off of, for the most part. Without language, there wouldn't be writing. Without something to write about, there wouldn't be writing. If you look at poetry, for example, poetry has been around. Poetry and prose have been around, you know, since the beginning of writing. And there are so many poets that use different methods of the pace and the sound of the words and the flow of the whole piece. It's all reflective of what they're trying to convey. Before this century, a lot of books, a lot of poetry have been banned, but now, not only with the dawn of the internet, less and less books are becoming banned. You know, you can go to your local bookstore and, you know, as time goes on, there's less and less. A lot of people are running over the same old ground, so there are people who are looking for new ways, like new ideas constantly. And now it's really hard to censor ideas, so there's a lot of very interesting media coming out now.
inventions, changing the game. There were some great controversies actually in medieval times regarding the intent of musical material and like the literature, like some of the texts that went along with it. Actually, as early as the 12th century, monks started writing all these secular songs and like poetry and prose, and this actually later inspired one of the most influential pieces of the 20th century. There's this piece of music, early 20th century. It's Karl Orff's Carmina Burana, Monster. The texts were taken from like medieval time periods. It's all these like controversial scenes that it describes, like getting drunk in the tavern, gambling, like prostitution, all this just crazy stuff that was going on. And it was all taboo at the time. When Carmina Burana was first performed, it actually caused a riot. And it wasn't just because of the content, but also the musicality. When Carmina Burana was performed, it was one of the first times that music, especially like classical music, was portrayed forebodingly or abrasively.
Another example of music-breaking inventions, Holst's first suite from the early 1900s, which set the groundwork for wind band exclusive pieces because it was one of the first pieces written for exclusively wind band. 1800s, most pieces were written for a full orchestra.
So James Joyce, it took him 17 years to write, but he came out with this book called Finnegan's Wake.
It's sort of a different kind of book. That actually came along with a lot of the sort of modernist movement in the 20th century, especially like the early 20th century, and that's kind of what I've been into, especially music-wise. Like we were talking about Carmina Burana earlier, that was part of that entire movement. The other thing is talking about a lot of those texts from medieval times. Those were talking about drinking, gambling, prostitution, those things that were taboo at the time and kind of broke out, and that's what was happening in the time period. And similarly, in the early 20th century, music was being made that was very abrasive, sort of very violent music, and that was a reflection on the time because at the time, the two world wars were happening. And it was the biggest economic downturn in history. So a lot of poverty, a lot of death, a lot of that sort of thing. It was the first time atonal music came around, which was music that had no tonal center. It was all over the place. And these composers, these people who were writing it, were reflecting on their time period. And a while back, I watched a film called The Experimenter, and it depicted the life of Stanley Milgram. Was a psychologist at Yale. I believe he was a student at the time, actually. And he did these experiments that were on obedience. They would make somebody think that they were inflicting harm on another person. However, due to the authority exercised, the subject would keep going. It would keep inflicting pain on the individual. Eventually the experiment ended, and it was found out that they were just audio clips of somebody in pain. Throughout the film, the person who was portraying Stanley kept relating his findings back to the Holocaust and the Nazis, because there was an element of obedience there, and also of conformity. Stanley's mentor, Solomon Asch, did a number of experiments regarding conformity, and I remember there were some clips from the film that depicted these experiments. Some included a subject that was told to enter an elevator and face the wall, which resulted in the subject eventually turning the other way, because everybody else in the elevator was turned that way.
This is just kind of like, alright, so I'm gonna talk about something random, somehow, right, okay. In my own life, I'll talk to people and it seems like they're totally connected to like the subcultures of the internet, all the weird stuff that happens on social media. Not necessarily between like real people, but not like friends, but like stars that'll tweet certain things, or like news, or certain things like vaporwave, which is out there, things like that, right?
It's like only surface knowledge that they have.
Yeah, and part of the time for myself, like, I'll waste my time on social media, wasting it as we call it, right? For long periods of times, and I'll learn a lot of stuff, and it's like this entirely kind of different world that you're kind of in, and people's personalities are a lot different. I can't think of
So
it.
do you ever take watermelon?
Dude,
You cut it in half, right? And then you take the half and you just get a spoon and go at it.
have you ever taken an onion, looked at the onion, and realized that that onion has layers?